We is on. Hi, I'm John Toohey, and I'm here today with author, editor, and journalist Michael Cannell. He has written Incendiary, the Psychiatrist, Mad Bomber, and the Invention of Criminal Profiling, which is a wonderful, wonderful book, by the way, and I hope he'll come back. And I've invited Dr. Henry Lee to come on with us because that criminal profiling is really incredible. He has also written a book on I Am Pei. I'm pretty sure it's pronounced Pei, even though it's P-E.
It is, yeah, I Am Pei.
I thought I'd been mispronouncing it. Who, Mandarin of Modernism, who I didn't know until I looked at your book, built the National Gallery.
He built the National Gallery and he built the glass pyramid at the Louvre Museum.
Yeah, amazing. We have a miniature glass, right, on the mall?
On the mall in Washington?
DC, we have a miniature version. It's not quite the same. Michael has worked as a reporter for UPI, Time Magazine. He was an editor for New York, for the New York Times. He has written for New Yorker, Newsweek, Sports Illustrated, and many, many others. His book is Brotherhood Betrayed, the man behind the rise and fall of Murder, Inc. And by the way, it's now, I looked, it's an Amazon bestseller and it's approaching #1 on true crime books. Congratulations.
Thank you.
It's wonderful. I wanted to, before I do, it's a really well-written book. It does not have the traditional machine gun, rapid fire, fact, which has a place, I think you'll all agree on, in crime books. But it's tenured, and so there is some lead into the stories and so forth. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you. It's great to be here with you all.
Good. Listen, I was going to ask you why a relish, because it's a long way from Mr. Pie, rather. But firstly, could you give us a breakdown for those who may not know on what Murder, Inc. was?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would explain Murder, Inc. this way. During Prohibition, the mob made money without even trying very hard. The guys who were the neighborhood thugs who stuck people up on the street and broke into grocery stores, all of a sudden were making piles of money. And they were controlling networks of bootlegging and smuggling booze in and loading it on armadas of trucks, and they controlled speakeasies and they controlled prostitution and gambling. All of a sudden they were a big deal and they made a lot of money. And they also lived large. They were very large figures in our culture. Yeah. When Prohibition ended, or when it was clear that it was gonna end, the mob had to figure out what they were gonna do next, how the easy money was gonna come to an end. So they had to figure out what would happen next. And their idea, primarily Lucky Luciano's idea, I believe, was that organized crime would become really organized, and they would run organized crime like a very efficient coast-to-coast corporation with franchises in every major city, and they did that. And part of their plan was to make sure that they would never be prosecuted. How could they stop people from prosecuting them? Well, their idea was that if there were no informants, if nobody could testify against them, then there would be no prosecutions. So they set up an assassination squad, which came to be known as Murder, Inc. They didn't call it Murder, Inc. A reporter in New York called it Murder, Inc. and the name stuck. But the Murder, Inc.'s job, and it was headed by a man named Abe Reles, who came out of the very, very tough neighborhood of Brownsville, Brooklyn. Their job was to travel the country killing informants, and by some counts they killed hundreds of them. And their plan worked for what would you say, about a decade before it went bad. And when it went bad, it really went bad.
I had no idea Abe Reles ran the thing. I thought he was just a
well, let's say, when I say he ran it, he was sort of the field general.
Right.
he would sit in an all-night candy store. It was called a candy store, but it's really kind of more like a coffee shop in Brooklyn. And he and his lieutenants would sit in the back, and they would wait for the phone call to come in from from the big bosses, from Lepke Buchalter or Albert Anastasia, and then it was Reliz's job to really make the hit happen.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I didn't know.
He was the shop foreman.
Yeah,
And he-
yeah, or a field general.
Yours is sort of better.
And he was a little man, I think, wasn't he?
He was a sort of physically a strange looking man. He was short, and when people described him, they always talk about how he had these kind of like Popeye arms that hung unnaturally low. There's like his fists sort of hung low down around his knees, and he spoke with a kind of a strange lisp. So I think people always assumed that he was kind of dumb or kind of impaired in some way, but it turned out that was not the case. He when he eventually became an informant himself, he demonstrated that he had an unbelievable memory for the details of these murders, like a cinematic memory.
Yeah.
He could remember the expression "to know where the bodies were buried." I mean, he literally knew where the bodies were buried, hundreds of them.
Yeah.
And he knew all of the surrounding circumstances behind each of those murders. And what's more, he also knew exactly what the district attorneys needed. He had over the years had acquired a kind of street knowledge of the law, and so he was not the imbecile that people thought he was.
I thought he was. From what I'd read, he was a dim bulb. But I thought he was only 5'4" or something.
I was going to speak to that now. Are there recordings of him, or do pictures bear out what the popular opinion was at the time? Because what you sort of notice with a lot of these media descriptions, when you look at contemporary descriptions, and then what we've come to learn earlier is it's almost sort of a reverse anthropomorphizing is where you see sort of the long arms or the sloping forehead or the guttural speech. And what we come to learn afterwards is that was more of a media projection. That was what was projected upon them, because they were considered to be these street men, and it turns out they were businessmen in their own right.
Well, that's a really interesting question. What were they sort of did the newspapers covering all of this kind of turn him into a cartoon character? I think that's what I mean, maybe, yes. But on the other hand, this description that I've tried to give you is very close to what a district attorney who sat in with him on the many days and nights when he spilled out these accounts of these murders. That's the way the district attorneys described him. So
I would love to.
Yeah, I mean, I can't
wait to get this. Get your book. I'm excited about getting the book. John has shipped me one.
Oh, good.
Yeah, I bought one, and I have one you gave me, Michael. Thank you. But I have another. I don't know if Paul, they know a lot more about Chicago than I do, Paul and Cam, but I read, and I might be wrong, that Capone actually, when was the meeting in Atlantic City, 1928 or something? That he ended up in Atlantic City. Had you ever heard that, Paul?
I did not know that.
No. Michael, did you know anything about that?
The meeting in Atlantic City?
No, at the meeting in Atlantic City, Capone proposed, he was a big proponent of organizing crime. And he said, look, why don't we just this is messy. I've got my guys getting tracked down, we kill somebody. If I got a guy from New York come in and do it, or vice versa, everybody's happy. And that it was less laughed off.
I think that a lot, my opinion has always been that is sort of Torrio's influence. Then later on, when Torrio moved to New York after his time in Italy, Torrio was spending a great deal of time with Luciano and Costello, Then shortly after Maranzano and Mazzaria fell, Torrio's influence weighed heavily on Luciano when they formed the commission. And my personal opinion is that was Torrio's influence on Capone and later Torrio's influence on Luciano. That's my personal opinion as far as the genesis organization.
You may not be wrong because he imported Capone and he also imported someone else too. And he was imported from New York. So it might well.
Frankie Uale was brought in to kill
Frankie
Big
Yale.
Jim.
Yeah.
So
I mean, Cam, that timing fits with my understanding. When Maranzano went down, then the weight of authority shifted to Luciano, right? And then Luciano was able to carry through on this idea of organization and a kind of coast to coast organization.
Now, when you look at, I liked your idea of field general. You're right. Do you see it as sort of the, you speak of how these men in the street became sort of a larger, more of a corporate structure crime as it became organized. So I guess Murder Inc. would kind of be the operations division. I mean, the taskmasters. I mean, I guess the guys you would send in to fire somebody, I guess, to look at a more modern interpretation. When you're liquidating, these are the guys you sell in to liquidate the store. These are the guys that you have a specialized task, because the bookmakers aren't the guys you send out to hit. You need guys who are hitters.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of comical when you read about the Murder Inc. Lieutenants who, more than Reles, they were responsible for traveling and enacting these hits, and the descriptions of them, they really do sound, like you say, like middle management guys who, they would book a plane flight and they would pack a bag and they would have a change of clothes, and of course their bag would also contain a gun and a clothesline and an ice pick, but it was almost like a regional manager going to Chicago or Miami for a meeting, and he would be met by the local affiliates. He would do his job and then he would fly home. By most outward appearances, it looked like somebody, like a businessman going on a trip, an overnight business trip.
Yeah, let me ask you something. Is it me again? By the way, that was Harry Feeney, who worked for the New York.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Up with the name. Is it me, or except for Happy Meon, there might be Mayon, there may be a few others. It was a Jewish organization. That's how I've always seen it. Or is that not true?
Well, Reles himself referred to his organization, which kind of morphed into Murder Inc. He referred to it as the combination, and I assume he referred to it as the combination because it was he was Jewish, and two of his sidekicks were Jewish, but they also worked with Happy Mayoni and his associate Dasher Abandando.
Right.
And so it was this idea of Jewish and Italian thugs, from, I call them thugs because they really just grew up in these neighborhoods as they were kids in these neighborhoods, and they knew each other. And Brownsville was primarily Jewish, and the surrounding neighborhoods were Italian. And so when Abe Reles wanted to be the top guy in that part of Brooklyn, he had to overthrow his former employers, the three Shapiro brothers.
Yeah.
And he didn't feel like he could do it on his own. And so he formed this alliance with his Italian neighbors, and with them on board, he had the muscle to knock off. He killed the three Shapiro brothers, and then he was the alpha dog in that part of Brooklyn, and that in turn led to his assignment in Murder Inc. Because the big bosses, Anastasia, Lepke, Buchalter, Luciano, they noticed what was happening out in Brooklyn, and they followed Abe Relaz's rise.
So it was Rellis that killed the Shapiro brothers.
Relaz did, and his men.
I know a lot about, I went to the murder scenes, but I didn't know that. I couldn't figure out why they were killed. They had gotten out of line or something. So that's, well, that answers the question, doesn't it?
Well, the Shapiro brothers were arrogant, and they were trespassing on other people's, rackets. And so Relez went to Anastasia and asked for permission, right? He didn't do it on his own. So he asked for permission to get rid of the Shapiro brothers, and Anastasia gave his blessing.
Did Rellis speak to, and I apologize if you've covered this, like I said, I've not read your book yet. Did Rellis speak to more practical aspects? Who footed the bill, like you said, if they have to pack up and go out of town? I mean, how do they handle the finances? I mean, I know a lot of times in the Italian world, murder is just something you're assigned to, but I know murdering tended to be more contracted. Was it just a flat fee and you go do the job and the expenses come out of your pocket? I think for people who aren't familiar, was there an expense account for the entire organization? I know I've heard different versions, but
again, it was sort of comically resembles, Dunder Mifflin. It was a lot of these guys were put on a retainer,
right,
and then they were paid, an added fee per hit. And in some cases, they were paid so little.
Yeah.
Not the lieutenants, but the soldiers on, a level beneath the lieutenants. They were paid so little that sometimes they would come home with, Pretty Levine. You know that name, Pretty Levine?
Levine, yes.
Yeah. So when Pretty Levine was sent to the Catskill Mountains to participate in the murder of Walter Sage. Walter Sage had committed the cardinal crime of skimming profits from the slot machines. And so when Pretty Levine came back after this successful hit, he said that he came back, by the time he had paid his own expenses, he came back with something like $4 or $5 in his pocket.
Yeah. The guy who killed one of the two murderers, Dutch Schultz, that was a Murder Inc. hit, right?
Yes.
He was a drug addict. I've forgotten his name, but he went through their pockets after he shot those guys.
Yes. And allegedly that's why he was left behind at the crime scene.
Yeah.
And he had to make as you probably know, he had to make his way back to Manhattan on his own.
By the way, the Magoon, I think his name was Blue Jaw Magoon.
I don't think it was Blue Jaw Magoon. I'm sort of blanking on the names of those two guys, but I don't think it was Blue Jaw Magoon.
For years, the story was he went out to Las Vegas and became a casino manager. But I have it on pretty good authority that he moved over to Bridgeport, as did a lot of those guys, and just filtered into the life in Bridgeport, which is like a tiny little Brooklyn.
Bridgeport, Connecticut?
Huh?
Bridgeport, Connecticut?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, well, rumor, who knows? Let me ask you something. Why did Rellis so readily turn informant on the deadliest organization, I think, in the history of organized crime?
Was he a moneymaker on his own before he moved on? Before we get too far, I just want to know, was he a moneymaker in addition to being a hitter? Was he making his money committing murder?
Oh yeah, I mean before he was made the head of what came to be known as Murder Inc., he had, when he overthrew the Shapiro brothers, he took over their operations. So he controlled he controlled the racketeering and gambling operations in that part of Brooklyn. So if you can kind of picture just the geography of Brooklyn, that wouldn't be, that wouldn't be the docks that Anastasia controlled, but it's the eastern part of Brooklyn.
Right, and I think a lot of people aren't familiar. The docks as they were in Brooklyn are no more, but at that time it was quite sizable. Now it's the park, but
right.
Mother is from Brownsville, by the way, Paul. And
No kidding.
yeah, she grew up there. Yeah, yeah. He elected the first communist in American history to Congress, whose name I've forgotten. But
As John said, what did precipitate
his rolling over?
Well, he, as you gentlemen know, the police would haul these figures in on vagrancy, just trumped up charges. It happened with Rellas over and over and over again. They called it tickling, and they would go in, they would maybe spend a night in jail, and then the charges would be dismissed. It was a way of getting them off the street or a way of harassing them, just a way of kind of provoking them. And he was actually hauled into jail with two of his men on some murder evidence. I think he probably expected to make his way out of jail, as he almost always had. But a couple of things happened. One is that the district attorneys put him and his cohorts in separate jails in separate boroughs of New York. And the idea was to try to make it difficult for them to communicate. And so Relez became paranoid that his associates were talking, that they were turning state's evidence. And it was like a game of musical chairs. He didn't want to be the one left standing when the music stopped. The other thing that happened at that time was that he had developed an illness. He was spitting up blood. He would throughout the day, he would fill a couple of glasses
wow,
with blood. He would spit, like every 10 minutes or so, he would spit up some blood. He
wow,
wasn't, he wasn't like vomiting blood. He was just, it was like a slow coughing, spitting blood. He was convinced that he had cancer, and he really thought that he was going to die. And so he thought that this was sort of, this was all over for him regardless. And so making a deal with the district attorney was in part about ensuring that his family would be taken care of.
who was the district attorney?
Well, the district attorney in Brooklyn was William O'Dwyer,
Right.
and he later became mayor of New York. And that kind of figures into this story.
Right.
It's a jumping ahead, but William O'Dwyer was mayor of New York, and he resigned very abruptly,
Yeah.
and he became ambassador to Mexico.
Yeah.
And there is reason to believe that he was getting out of New York and getting out of the country because questions were being asked about Abe Reliz's death.
I'll bet.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Now, what year was this Relis was picked up and put in jail?
Well, he
Within
died in November of 1941.
Okay.
So he was arrested January of the previous year, I guess, no, early
Right.
February.
Right.
And so he spent, the late winter, spring, and summer in confinement. First at a hotel in Brooklyn called the Brossard, I believe is how you pronounce it. And then later, he and other informants were housed in a hotel in Coney Island called the Half Moon Hotel. And they blocked off an entire suite. The press called it the Rat Suite. And they built a steel wall to kind of block off that corridor, that part of the hotel. they had police from the local precinct downstairs, and then they had a rotating 24-hour police guard in the suite, in and outside of the suite itself.
When I was there 5 years ago, I went all the way out to Coney Island from Manhattan. I had no idea really how far it is by subway, but that building was still there. It's an old age home. I don't know, maybe they've knocked it down since.
I think it's been knocked down since you were there. I think they demolished it. Yeah. I mean, it was built as kind of a glorious, it was meant to be like a grand hotel that would stand, it wasn't really part of the kind of slightly, honky tonk. When we think about Coney Island, we think of like hot dogs and beer.
Yeah.
It was kind of it was built as a pretty elegant hotel.
Yeah, yeah. Let me ask you, Lucky Luciano said about Relis being tossed out the window. He said that bird could sing, but he couldn't.
Anybody couldn't fly.
That was later in the waterfront, on the waterfront. Joey Doyle and the boxer who played the thug in the film said the same line. But the fact that, now I should ask instead of telling, is it true? Wasn't it true that Anastasia used Murder Inc. as his primary enforcers? Because a lot of people were killed on the New York waterfront, rebels.
Yeah, I mean, Murder Inc. would certainly have been at his beck and call.
Yeah.
My sense, having worked on this book, is that most of Murder Inc.'s work, well, it certainly did take place in New York, but when we think about them acting as enforcers, it would typically have been, they would fly to Detroit or Chicago or Miami to do their work. It wasn't really necessarily based in New York.
Yeah.
Certainly, this was a time when mob bosses in Chicago or Detroit or what have you could pick up the phone and call mob bosses in any other city. This was not a time when they had to worry about surveillance. They were really, it was a much more cohesive organization. A lot of mob watchers now say, well, the 70s was when it was, but absolutely not. When you look at the mob in the 40s and the 50s, that was the absolute apex when it was, before any of this surveillance, before Appalachian, before there was even acknowledgement by the federal government that it existed, with the exception of the DEA. And you can make a phone call to New York where you knew there was an organization who would take care of your problems. You would send the retainer, you would pay it, you would, bet on whatever horse race, or you would pass on whatever information that you controlled. They would send out some guys from out of town that you didn't know. They would take care of the problem, and then that would be it. It was a much larger, more cohesive organization that had less risk. I can imagine they were all over the country.
Yeah, I mean, you said it a lot better than I could say it. It was very clean and efficient. The mob bosses in Miami or St. Louis were happy to do with this arrangement, of course, because then they didn't have to worry about being implicated. It was done very efficiently, and it was done all over the country. Just listening to you describe it, Cam, what kind of comes to my mind is how I think most Americans, when they think of the mafia, they think of The Godfather.
Yeah.
And really, The Godfather, I mean, not to diminish the dark parts, the darkness of The Godfather, but really what we see in The Godfather, the book or the movie, is kind of small time compared to this period that we're talking about. This was a coast to coast murder operation that killed hundreds of people.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Michael, could I ask you the simple question? I know enough about it to keep up, but not a whole lot. But I know that Anastasia was called by the press the Lord High Executioner of Murder Inc. Was that how it worked? That people would have to go through Anastasia to use these hitters, or did they go right to Kid Twist, or what was the hierarchy there?
Well, I can't say that they never went directly to Reles, but my understanding is that they had to go through the big bosses, one level of hierarchy above Abe Reles, which would have been Anastasia or Lepke Buchalter or Luciano.
They belong to
maybe
Anastasia.
Bugsy Siegel. I don't really know.
I think, yeah, they probably belong to the Italian spa, I think is what, when we think of the modern equivalent.
I mean, Abe Rella's described in his long and voluminous description of all this to the district attorneys, he described sitting by the phone in that candy store that I mentioned earlier. So I think it really was literally like the payphone would ring and it would be Lucky Luciano or Buchalter on the other end of the line, giving him, that week's assignment.
Imagine that reality. That was an actual occurrence in this country, that there was a place where you would have a problem, you go to somebody, and there was somebody sitting by a phone waiting to call and dispatch people to murder. I mean,
That was,
And the irony of it is just amazing that for a decade or more, this organization was in charge of snuffing out rats and informants. And then the end winds up with their main guy becoming an informant. You would think that he would have known very well what his fate was going to be, yet he went that way anyway. And I think that's an incredible irony.
absolutely, Paul.
Well, yeah, I mean, he knew that the minute he made a deal with William O'Dwyer and the other district attorneys, that he would become enemy number one for his former friends and associates. And that is exactly what happened. But bear in mind that because he was spitting up blood, he thought that he was going to die.
Yeah.
So he just figured that he was going to die anyway.
did he manage to testify at all?
Yes, he did testify. He did testify in the trials of his 4 lieutenants, the 2 Jewish lieutenants and the 2 Italian lieutenants.
Electrocuted, right?
Oh, what's that?
They were electrocuted, weren't they?
They were all sent to Sing Sing. They were all 4 of them were electrocuted. Yeah. And then he was about literally that day going to testify in the trial of Lepke Buchalter when he went out the window of his hotel room and was found dead on the gravel roof of the kitchen annex next to the hotel.
But the body flew some remarkable amount of feet from, unless he could fly, it wasn't possible. So it was something like 15, 20 feet from the main building, right?
Right. So the police called this an escape attempt.
Yeah.
And they did find the body with 2
Sheets,
beds
wasn't it?
tied together.
Yeah, yeah.
But as you've mentioned, the forensics show that his body landed further from the hotel wall than you would expect somebody to land if they simply had lost their grip and fallen. His landing spot suggested a trajectory, that would be associated with being thrown out the window.
Well, there were 5 cops in the room, right? 5 uniformed cops, plus, is it Ball, pronounced Ball?
Mm-hmm.
Commander Ball?
Yeah, I mean, they were probably not in the room, but they would have been in the suite. They would have been they would have been on the corridor somewhere.
Yeah. Ball, it's Captain Ball, right?
Yeah.
Captain.
Go ahead, John.
I spent most of the day researching him. But it seemed that he was not, as I thought, just a local commander. He was really high up and well regarded in the New York Police Department. And he had contact with O'Dwyer and that type, so he was that high up. But also, from what I could see, he went to Florida, lived happily ever after. Didn't seem to be anything wrong in his life. He got away with it then, right?
Well, I mean, part of what happened was that Reles, as we've said, went out the window either voluntarily or involuntarily, and then O'Dwyer became mayor, and then O'Dwyer very abruptly resigned, and he became ambassador to Mexico, and there has been some. As I alluded to before, there has been some speculation that he went to Mexico because this question of police involvement or knowledge in Reliz's death was coming up. People were asking a question about whether the police were involved in Reliz's death. Let's just back up for a second and remember that Reliz knew not just about these murders, but he had a kind of encyclopedic knowledge of all the police who were taking bribes, and not just the patrolmen on the street, but up the police ranks.
Yeah,
And not just up the police ranks, but city officials
yeah.
and possibly judges and possibly district attorneys.
Wow.
So I don't want to sound hyperbolic.
No, but I didn't know that.
Yeah,
Pretty hyperbolic times.
a lot of city officials stood to lose a lot if Abe Relez started to talk about the bribery operations. And so
Wasn't,
Bob wanted to see Abe Relez die, but the city officials also wanted to see him die.
and who was the guy who was going to testify again the next day? What was his name?
Well, Abe Relez was supposed to testify.
Again,
And he died hours before he was to have been transported to the courtroom.
I think there's also a difference between the elected chair and the death sentence then versus now. I mean, now you get the death sentence, and I think it's 10 to 13% of people who are sentenced receive the death penalty. And I'm not commenting, I'm just saying the actual pragmatic application of the death penalty versus then. Lucky Burkhalter was sentenced in 41, and and he was a year and a half later, he was in the chair. I mean, if you were sentenced then, you were in the chair within a year and a half, and you were dead. It was not a bunch of appeals and everything. So if Relez pointed you were done.
okay.
Yeah, I mean, and my sense, Cam, is that was sort of the last period when that was true. It may have been the last period when you went to death row, it really was a death sentence.
What I was asking you, Michael, is Buckhalter was the one he was going to testify.
Yes, I'm sorry. Buckhalter was the one who was.
So he was not just another shooter. Wasn't he fairly high up?
No, he was Buckhalter. It's interesting. I don't know how much you know about him, but he was not a flamboyant figure the way Luciano was or Bugsy Siegel was. He was a quiet person who stayed at home in the evenings and led a very kind of normal domestic life. So he wasn't a kind of flamboyant, larger than life figure, but he was, which maybe is why people don't know his name so much. But he was absolutely in that top. He was in the boss tier.
So then,
as I understood it, Luciano and the rest set up Burkhalter so they could have his, once things consolidated amongst the Italians, they basically set up Burkhalter so that they could have his rackets, and that was why he sort of fell rather quickly without their. I mean, that may be a flight of fancy, but that was always kind of how I understood things, as he was sort of left out to dry.
Well, I don't know how to answer that, Cam. I don't know that I've ever seen any evidence that they set him up. Buckhalter went into hiding, and I don't remember how long he was in hiding. It was maybe a year or a little more than a year. And he thought that he would turn himself in and get a deal.
Okay.
Right. So there's a sort of this sort of interesting, complicated story where he did not want to turn himself into William O'Dwyer, because he knew that if he turned himself in to William O'Dwyer, that he would likely go to the electric chair. He wanted to turn himself into the feds and face tax evasion charges and get a lesser sentence. So he contacted Walter Winchell, the gossip columnist, and Walter Winchell brokered Buckhalter's surrender. So there's a scene where Walter Winchell's in a car and is being told where to go in New York, and he picks up Buckhalter and then they go and they're told where J. Edgar Hoover is parked. And so the gossip, just incredible. The gossip columnist takes the mob boss and turns him into J. Edgar Hoover.
Oh,
That's
wow.
a kind of a long-winded way of saying that he turned himself in, thinking he was getting a sweet deal, but in fact, he ended up being tried by William O'Dwyer and going to the electric chair.
It's an incredible answer, is what it is. I know that Burkhalter used to travel back and forth to Chicago during the Brown Beoff scandal. Burkhalter went representing Luciano. He met with Nitti and Nitto and Paul Rica and several of them to deal with the affairs in Los Angeles. That was speaking back to the multi, the national corporation. That was Burkhalter would go back and forth to Chicago a few times.
Hoover also had a wonderful way of showing up on big news items. When there was a dull period during World War II, he showed up remarkably for Roger Toohey's arrest. And Basil Banghart used the famous word, "You don't look as fat as you sound on radio." But he was also there with
Karpis, Alvin Karpis, yeah.
Yeah.
It was his first arrest.
Yeah. So by 1952, it was gone. Is that correct?
You're talking about Murder Inc.?
Murder.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think what happened is that World War II is what happened, and everything stopped during World War II, and Luciano was in jail, and there's a sort of a complicated, interesting story about how he was released from jail in return for helping the war effort. You probably know that story. But World War II happened, and then after the war, the somehow the Jewish mob didn't resume. The Italians did pick up where they left off, but the Jewish mafia, the Jewish mob, really didn't exist, as far as I know, after World War II.
Yeah. In Chicago, there was an arm, right, Paul?
Oh, yes. Yes. Lenny Patrick's group stayed strong right into the 80s.
Yeah. By the way, that was Seymour Bluejaw Magoon, and he supposedly lived under the name Joe Mulligan. So he lived to tell the tale. What led you to because it's a long way from Pay and even the Mad Bomber, who was more of an incompetent than anything. What led you to? I know you're a Manhattanite.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I don't have a background in this subject the way the three of you do. I'm not an expert, as you can probably tell. I was working on this my previous book, Incendiary, which is about the first case of criminal profiling, and while I was researching that, I just saw something about Abe Relez going out the window of the hotel, and it just caught my eye, and I started to read about it. And my feeling is that people shouldn't write books unless they're really obsessed with the subject, and it's easy to be obsessed with this subject, I think. Murder Inc. and the mystery of Abe Relez's murder, I just couldn't get enough of it. And also for me, I'm trying to write books in a genre that's known as narrative nonfiction. That's a style that's associated with Eric Larson, who wrote Devil in the White City.
Great book.
Hillenbrand, who wrote Seabiscuit. So these are books that are true, they're history, they're nonfiction, they're journalism, but they're shaped like novels. And so this story, as I began to read about it, I could tell that it really fit that mold. It really, just reading about it felt like binge watching a Netflix show.
By the way, Cam and I have MFAs in literature.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, don't tarnish me with the organized crime brush just because I have a hobby of it.
Okay, well,
I'm teasing. We've all got our dirty secrets.
So I read that
Paul's an attorney.
he could get into the MFA program. No,
He's a
I think he'll
polymath.
become a lawyer.
need to get into the MFA program. That's the high point. Had you read, the reason I always thought they were Murder Inc. was really bottom of the barrel. Rellis, and I don't know the other fellow's name, the police had him in a safe house on the Hudson River, and he took a policeman's gun and shot himself. Which, do you know which one that was? Also a murdering
He
gun.
took the policeman's gun and shot the policeman.
No, shot himself.
Himself.
I don't know who that is.
How
Both of
large
the
an organization was it? About how many members did you?
40s, and he had a brother that was in the mob as well. But anyway, my point is, anyway, that the cops made written reports. They didn't want to go with Rellis or this other guy because they smelled, and their body odor and their general cleanliness was lack. Had you read that these guys were just crude and rude and
Well, completely crude and rude. And Rella's, I mean, when they were housing Rella's at the Half Moon Hotel, everybody in that suite was complaining about Rella's. He never bathed. He wore the same clothes every day, and I mean, he was really played a lot of sort of mean jokes on the police relentlessly, and also on his associates, the other informants who were on the down the hall, and
I think you'd
and
throw
he
a
was
guy out the
drunk.
window for.
I'm sorry, what?
Kind of thing you'd throw a guy out the window for.
Well, actually,
Oh,
when some people have speculated about who threw him out the window, some people would argue that the police may just have thrown him out the window just because they were tired of.
yeah. I've had that feeling once or twice myself. In fact, if I get one more YouTube from what's his name, what's next? Where you go?
Well, I'm working on another Mafia book now. I haven't signed the contract with the publisher yet, so I probably shouldn't say what it is, I guess.
Right.
But it's Brooklyn in a later time period. It's Brooklyn in the 70s and 80s when things were very different. They were not organized the way they're organized now in this time period we're discussing.
Yeah.
And when the FBI and the district attorneys were just about to try to use the RICO laws to bust the mob. So it's that moment just before Rudy Giuliani enters the scene and shuts down a lot of their operations.
Yeah. I hadn't heard of Murder Inc. I know they went upstate New York and shot the fellow Atticus. Is that his name? There's a famous picture.
Yeah,
online.
the guy who was lying next to his taxi.
Was that in New York or
Yeah, that was in the Catskill Mountains
in Catskills?
in upstate New York. Yeah.
I have a hard time seeing those guys in the Catskills, don't you?
It is kind of funny, isn't it? But they, as you probably know, that was a favorite spot for killing people, for killing their own guys, and it was a favorite place for dumping bodies, and when a couple of they caught these guys and these trials took place in the Catskills. One time, one of the farmers said to the district attorney, "Now that I know how many bodies are buried up here, I'm afraid to plow my field."
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, Michael, what do you really think happened? You spent a lot of time working on this. You know a lot more about it than we do. What really happened to Abe Rellis?
Paul, I've been hoping nobody would ask me that, because I think after spending years on this book, I should probably have an original take on it, and I should come to some kind of conclusion. But to be honest, I don't know that the evidence really points to any any real conclusion. The best I can say is that I would be very surprised if the mob was not involved in throwing Abe Relez out the window. And I would be very surprised if they didn't do it with the police's consent.
Wow.
I think that they probably, if I had to guess, I would say that they probably collaborated on it because they both benefited from it. I mean, as I said earlier, the police and city officials didn't want Relez to talk about the prolific corruption. They had almost as much to lose as the mob did. And it's worth bearing in mind that in those days, more so than now, the mob guys and the police guys, they grew up together.
Yeah.
They lived in the same neighborhoods and they went to the same schools and they dated the same girls. And so the interaction between them, yes, the cops were and the detectives were chasing the mob down, but there was a very, there was a kind of almost kind of cooperative relationship there that, that is probably hard for us to imagine today. So it's easy to imagine, for me to imagine them making a plan together.
Oh, we're from Chicago. It's pretty easy to imagine.
Happened fairly recently, didn't it, Paul?
What's that?
It was a thug on the Chicago police force.
Oh, it's a tradition here.
You know what I'm talking about? I mean, that was in recent memory.
Yeah, there have been dozens over the years.
Yeah, and a couple made guys whose brothers were cops.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Petrocelli and Feckerato's brothers were cops.
Really?
Tony Accardo's bodyguard was a lieutenant in the Chicago Police Department for years.
Isn't that incredible?
Yeah.
Yeah. He went to Italy with him.
That's the one.
Wow.
Yeah.
Incredible.
So it's pretty easy for us to imagine that exactly what you're saying, Michael.
Yeah.
Collaboration between the police and the mob.
Because they did collaborate, they collaborated and cooperated on a lot of other stuff.
Michael,
Sure.
Go to any of the spots? Because there's quite a few. Rose's candy store, right?
Right. Roses, they called it Midnight Roses because it was open all night.
That's building is there, I think.
It's now a bodega, like a corner grocery store, and it's right underneath the elevated subway on a corner in Brownsville.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I did think that, I had a sort of like half serious notion that it would be possible to set up a kind of a Murder Inc., walking tour of Brownsville.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But Brownsville today is not in good shape, or am I wrong?
Brownsville has always been, if not the poorest neighborhood in America, one of the poorest neighborhoods in America. And it was then Jewish and, later became Black and Hispanic. And it's really, in New York, it's really the bottom of the barrel in New York in terms of services and crime. It's just almost hard to believe that it's part of America.
When I went there with my mother in 1972, she hadn't been back since the 50s. It literally looked like there had been a war. There were buildings that were half knocked down. There were open fires on the street. It was really...
You went there with your mother in the 70s?
72, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that does not surprise me. That does not surprise me at all. Parts of that part of Brooklyn would have looked like that. I mean, it was a war zone. It was a war zone then.
Yeah. I know that talking to my mother who grew up there in Brownsville, and these guys, this is why I say laughing at him in the Catskills, but seeing these guys, these Brownsville guys go across the country. My mother never went to Manhattan in her life. There was no reason to go to Manhattan, she said. But to her, as an example, if you were to talk to her, you would think Coney Island was the Bahamas. I mean, it was really an exotic trip. I'm having it, when you say Relish traveling to, I'm amazed he found his way back. Not that he was dumb. These,
Well, yeah, I mean, when they flew him out to they flew him and one of his sidekicks, a man named TikTok Tannenbaum,
yeah,
flew them to Los Angeles because the district attorney in Los Angeles was putting the heat on Bugsy Siegel. And, Abe Reles had probably never been outside of New York State himself. He didn't travel out of state for these hits. He'd been to Chicago to meet with, mob officials there, but to fly across the country was
like
for
the
him,
West Coast.
it was just, unimaginable.
Tannenbaum also cooperated, right?
And
I'm sorry?
Tannenbaum cooperated.
He did.
Yeah.
my mother's people from the Bronx, and when they built the Cross Bronx Expressway is when they moved out to Jersey. That was when they tore down their building, and just moving out to North Jersey, it was like it being on another planet. So when you get these New Yorkers who are multi-generational, you're inside the nest, and it's another planet if you're born and bred and inside. So I can imagine somebody like Brett. So,
Yeah, I mean, I think people basically didn't leave their neighborhood very much in those days, and they didn't really need to. I mean, when John's mother would have grown up in Brownsville or lived in Brownsville, it would have been a very poor and dangerous neighborhood in some ways, but it would have been also have had everything there. There would have been lots of markets, and in a sense it was thriving, because it was teeming with life. And I think people back then just didn't leave their neighborhood. They had what they needed.
mm-hmm.
Relish testified in 80, gave, according to the police, this is their word, intricate details on 85 gangland murders. That's a lot to remember.
Jesus.
I couldn't.
Yeah, when he agreed to a deal with the district attorney, with William O'Dwyer's office, they gave him a sandwich and some coffee, and they basically said, go. And he filled up 20 stenographers' notebooks with details of murders.
Wow.
And the district attorneys have said that his descriptions were so grisly that at times the stenographer had to leave the room to compose herself.
Yeah.
So he, as I mentioned, he just had this incredible memory for the details and the timing, the sequence of events leading up to every one of these murders.
Has New York put that online? Please say yes. His testimony?
No, I don't think so. No, as far as I know, it was not recorded. They were transcribed, but not recorded.
So are the transcriptions available someplace in the world?
Yeah, you can find them at the Municipal Archives in downtown Manhattan.
Be great if it was online, wouldn't it? Boy, what a read that would be.
If you can find them at the Municipal Archives, if you're willing to go through the microfilm.
No. I did that in my first book. It was horrible.
It's a challenge.
Well, to find one thing, you had to go through the Chicago newspapers from day one through the last day of the year. It was just crazy.
Yeah.
Because there was no index, I have here Mayone and how is it pronounced? Abendando?
Abendanda.
Abendando. They were convicted of first-degree murder. It can't be. Mayone was killed. Is that right? Or is this? That must be wrong.
Well, Mayone died in the electric chair.
Oh, he did. Yeah.
Yeah.
With Phil Strauss and Buggy Goldstein.
Yes.
Phil Strauss's brothers, I think, is the fellow I think I'm talking about. Who?
He went by the name Pittsburgh Phil. His real name was Harry Strauss, but he went by the name Pittsburgh Phil, which is, I mean, I don't know how he got that. He'd never been to Pittsburgh in his life. He just wanted to be called Pittsburgh Phil for some reason.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting trying to figure out how some of them come by their come by their names. I mean, Pittsburgh Phil, the guy from Brooklyn.
I always wondered about Lepke. What kind of a nickname is Lepke?
Well, Lepke actually, like, there is some logic to that. Lepke came from his mother. So Lepke kind of was, it was like a twist on a Yiddish endearment that a mother might tell their child.
Yeah.
So that was his childhood nickname. But for some of these other guys, I think sometimes they would just, you guys know these names. I mean, Charlie Spinach, these crazy, these funny names, they just go on and on.
Paul, I told you I knew Joe Pignatello, who ran the mob restaurants out.
Joe Pigs, yeah.
So I called, he said, well, they call me Joe Pigs. And I said, trying to be sympathetic, well, I won't call you that. And he said, why not? So Joe Pigs, Here is the book. Can you guys see that correctly?
Yeah, it's beautiful.
I've ordered a copy since we've been on the call.
Oh, crap. Now you got two.
Well, I could not wait, John.
Well,
I did. I ordered it on my phone while we were talking.
All right. Well, why don't you ship that one to Paul then?
All
All right. That's fair. That's reasonable. This is the book. There will be at the end of this podcast, the cover, a great headshot of Michael and a brief background and where to get this. Obviously, it's going to be on Amazon as our primary place to get it, where it's selling very, very well. Before we leave, thank you, Michael. But before we leave, Paul, on behalf of Cam and I, and I'm sure Michael as well, we wish TJ the best of success tomorrow. We pray for her, and I'm sure she'll be fine.
Thank you.
We're thinking of her. Okay, Mike.
Thank you.
You've been very kind with your time. I appreciate it.
Hey, this is really great. I really enjoyed this, and it's super fun to talk to you guys.
Oh,
Incredible, Michael. Just thank you so much.
if you'd like to come back, I'd love to talk to you with us guys, and with
anytime. I would love to. I'd love to. That incendiary story is, I'm also obsessed with that one.
I told you I lived on Cherry and he lived on Orange. And I would see him in the morning,
Really? You
yeah.
would actually see him? George Matesky?
The house is still,
Yeah.
and the shack where he made these bombs is up and well too. So,
Huh.
yeah. And he used W, I think, which is how they found him, right? Waterbury.
They did, I'm sorry, say that again?
W on some things for Waterbury, didn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah. You can't take Waterbury out of the boy. Thank you. I do appreciate it. You guys interested in doing a podcast with Michael on architecture? Because it's really a fabulous story. Would you like to do that for my literary site?
Absolutely.
As a Chicago guy, I just am an architectural nut. And
Absolutely.
You should be.
Yeah.
That's beautiful.
Let's do it.
That's a beautiful city. Michael, thank you, senor. Men.
Thank you. Hey, this is great.
Absolutely. Had a blast.
thank you. I learned a lot.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.